Hi, I'm Bryan, and today I'm going to talk to you about how I moved over 22,000 devices from using PEAP MSCHAPv2 to EAP-TLS. I feel like most people in the room know what Eduroam is, but for those of you who might not or who are watching this video recording later on, Eduroam's an SSID. It's broadcast at over 38,000 locations worldwide, including primarily higher ed sites, but including government buildings, other research facilities, even a couple of airports. If you want to learn more about it, plenty of people to talk to, visit eduroam.org. But for the purposes of this presentation, all you need to know is that it's a .1x WPA-Enterprise network, just like any other typical corporate Wi-Fi network. At Dartmouth, we see over 10,000 simultaneous Eduroam users per day. Around 8% of that are visitors to our campus. It's our primary SSID. All of our students, faculty, staff, they connect to it every day. 80% of our users' devices are bring your own device. The remaining 20% of devices that are corporate issued, they're only lightly managed by MDM. We don't have a very strict requirement to have devices enrolled in MDM, and we're just really not set up to push certificates or profiles to everybody that connects to our network. If you've heard of WPA-Enterprise, .1x, NAC, Radius, any of these technologies, it all has to do with how a client authenticates to an enterprise network. Or, to use the technical jargon, how the supplicant sends credentials to the authenticator and then on to the authentication server. Then they're granted access or not. There are many EAP methods that can be used in enterprise Wi-Fi. These are just a few of them. And today I'm going to be talking mainly about the first two, EAP, PEAP, MSCHAPv2, and EAP-TLS. MSCHAPv2 is the authentication protocol that's typically used in Windows Active Directory environments, but it is also possible to use it in non-Windows directories too. This does require a full round trip of authentication information from the client all the way to the directory server and back. So AD gets queried for every single authentication that happens on your network, fast roaming aside. Clients using this method send their username and a hashed but unsalted password to the network. And I don't know about you, but I like my hash with a little bit of salt on it. EAP-TLS leverages the same certificate mechanisms that are used to secure websites with HTTPS. It's a pretty robust technology. It's been around for a while. The difference here is how those certificates get used. For websites, the certificates are used to encrypt traffic over the internet. But for authenticating to a network, it's just used to establish and prove your identity. Using that certificate information, the network access control system can then determine if a connection should be allowed or not. And using certificates in this manner requires provisioning and configuration of the client devices. It's unfortunately a little more complicated than just typing in a password. The client associates to an access point, sends its authentication credentials to the Radius server, which then checks the directory server for validity and permissions. With EAP-TLS and some other methods, the authentication and authorization steps can happen entirely within the Radius server. You don't even need to have a directory behind it. Credentials can optionally be checked by a directory server. At Dartmouth, we're not using one. Instead, we've encoded group membership and authorization information into the certificate at the time of issuance. This information is one of several broad categories, so it's unlikely that a user's certificate attributes are going to need to change very often. The only time that this really happens is if a student graduates and then they become a staff member with privileged access. In that scenario, all they need to do is rerun our onboarding tool and they're issued a new certificate with the proper credentials at that time. In practice, adding a directory lookup on top of EAP-TLS adds another 100 milliseconds of latency for the transaction to complete. This is a section of a graph that I did showing the time it takes for EAP-TLS, both with and without an AD lookup, to complete. I used a WLAN-PI and did real over-the-air testing. And I measured the timestamps between the EAP started event and the EAP success event, so that way I didn't have any false skew of the data for all of the other connection steps, such as background scanning, probe request, probe response, everything else. Oh, and just to go back to this slide for a moment, does anybody know the hashing algorithm that MSCHAPv2 uses for passwords? If you do, call it out. NTLM? Well, that's part of it. MD4. We all know that MD5 is pretty weak, right? But MD4 has been broken since 1995. That's 30 years ago, for those of you who are also in denial about your age. MSCHAPv2 is broken. It took them a while, but even Microsoft has now come out and said that, yeah, MSCHAP's got some issues, we're no longer recommending it. Because of this and other problems within Windows, Microsoft has developed a feature called Credential Guard. This is now enabled by default in Windows 11 and Server 2025. If you've not heard of this and you're using MSCHAPv2 for your environment, you need to look into it. You might see this feature impact your client's abilities to get connected to the network because Credential Guard disables the use of MSCHAPv2. It's only a matter of time, I feel, before other OS vendors also begin to deprecate this protocol. I was going to make a very bold statement here about how much more secure EAP-TLS is, but after some discussions with various people in the community, both in person and on Slack, I thought it would just be easier to have a slide with a big old asterisk saying that EAP-TLS can be very secure if it's implemented properly. The key to any security mechanism relies on proper implementation. I did want to call out a specific issue that I found as I was researching what other higher eds are doing for their Eduroam authentication. I won't name names, but I found guidance in public-facing documentation from several Eduroam members that instruct their users to not validate the server certificates. This makes it trivial to perform what's called an evil twin attack, where an attacker can broadcast Eduroam on an access point that they control and redirect authentication traffic to their own malicious Radius servers. Their servers can present any certificate because the clients aren't checking them. Since MD4 is so easily reversed, these attackers can then get your plain text passwords of your users. If you run Eduroam or any .1x network for that matter, please check and see what instructions you're providing to your users. The best practice here is definitely to validate certificates. So, how then can you transition away from MSCHAPv2 to EAP-TLS, as I've recently done? Lots of research. I've learned a ton about Radius and the WPA handshake and EPOL exchanges, and even more about PKI and X509 certificates just over the past year and a half. Once I wrapped my head, or thought I wrapped my head around everything I had been reading, I did a ton of testing. I mean, who here likes to play around with Wi-Fi equipment and see what the packets look like? I know Peter does. I implemented config in all types of client devices, ones that are common on my campus, ones that are less common. I played around with all the settings in the Radius backend, and then I wiped it all out and did it over and over again, sometimes trying to break the config intentionally to see where common problems might come from. While all major operating systems do support EAP-TLS, I discovered that a lot of devices that can do WPA-Enterprise only support MSCHAPv2. I really hope that if the Wi-Fi Alliance is listening, that they're going to consider mandating support for EAP-TLS as a minimum for WPA-Enterprise certifications. For the devices on my network that don't support EAP-TLS today, there's still a legitimate need to have them connected. So in parallel to this major process, I've also been rolling out an MPSK network. It's the best we can do at the moment, and it serves a business need. Communication to peers at my organization, stakeholders, power users, and of course our user-facing service desk was critical to the success of this project. Early on, I assembled a sort of a task force with members from each of these groups to get their input, walk them through the changes, make policy and implementation choices, and we also developed a very comprehensive communication strategy and a timeline for the general user population. This included early outreach to all of our user-facing support staff and owners of applications that may require special handling, such as point-of-sale and IoT systems. I was also in very frequent contact with our Radius and onboarding software vendors. At Dartmouth, we're now using Juniper Mist Access Assurance, and we're using a PKI and a client onboarding tool from Secure W2. I'm not going to spend my time here on stage doing product demos, but if you want to hear more about either of those, feel free to ask me or the vendors directly. I will say, though, that both of these companies were and continue to be fantastic. They answered a ton of my questions, provided plenty of valuable guidance, and held my hand at times as I worked through all the config and rolled out what is probably the largest user-facing change Dartmouth has seen in quite some time. Everyone who connects to Eduroam on our campus was going to be affected by this change. Honestly, it only took me 20 minutes to get access assurance working, but onboarding over 22,000 devices took much longer. We decided that a landing page, a website, would be the easiest way to communicate information about the change. wifi.dartmouth.edu, it's public-facing, you can view it yourselves, was created with the most pertinent information up front. FAQs, an easy upgrade button. This screenshot is what it looks like during the transition period, so if you're viewing it now, it's going to have a little bit of a slight different look. Different bullet points of information have been moved around. This page also had links to detailed step-by-step instructions and information on how to get further help should a user need it. Making the onboarding process as self-service as possible was a key goal. Otherwise, our help desk and my team and myself would have just been totally bogged down by user support requests. Since we don't have a really useful MDM solution, we did have to treat all devices as BYOD. So Secure W2 provided us with a cross-platform application. They test and maintain that software as OSs get updated, and it's been working really well. They're also very receptive to feedback, so thank you. What does an onboarding process look like? Well, here's an example for iPhones. Go to the website, click Connect, sign in, download the profile, which is going to contain your unique certificate, and then open the Settings app, approve the installation of the profile on your device. And if at that time you're in range of Eduroam, your device will connect automatically. The process is very similar for most OSs, including Linux. Unfortunately, I feel that macOS made this much more painful than it needed to be. There's something like, 17 password or accept prompts that a user needs to click through. But fortunately, it's nothing that requires them to go into any advanced settings and actually configure parameters. So behind the scenes, we had to make some significant changes to our Radius configuration. At the time we started this project, we were using ClearPass, and we decided to move to Mist. I had configured ClearPass to accept both EAP-PEAP MSCHAPv2 as well as EAP-TLS. You can accept multiple authentication methods in your Radius background. It's not exactly trivial to do this, but once it's set up, it does work really well. At some point in my testing, I also realized that you can have client profiles with multiple Radius servers and certificates for the same SSID. All the major OSs support this. What this meant was that after a device was onboarded with the new profile, they would still be able to authenticate with either the old Radius server or the new one post-cutover. There was no need to have a singular flag day where one method just suddenly turns off, the other one turns on, and suddenly all the users have to update everything all at once. This allowed us to have a very reasonable 6-month-long transition period. Around this time last year, I opened up the production version of all of this to a group of pilot users, and then after spring break, we released it to the rest of the campus population. We published messages in the weekly newsletter emails that get sent to everyone on campus. We did some custom outreach to different departments and groups of users. Our service desk also directly contacted those that they knew would need a little more hand-holding. We worked with the student government to do Instagram and social media blasts, though looking at the chart, that seemed to have had very little impact. We also sent out official emails from the same system and on the letterhead that messages from VIPs at the organization come from. We even got the CIO to sign his name at the bottom of them. And then as we neared the shutoff date of July 1st, we began sending targeted user emails along the lines of, our records show that you still have a device that hasn't been upgraded. You'll lose access if you don't upgrade by July 1st. That was a ton of data processing, trying to get it out of the Radius backend and come up with the mail merge, but I felt that it was worthwhile. I'll also note that we chose the date of July 1st, as it was far enough after graduation that students who would be leaving the campus anyway wouldn't have to worry about changing their devices, but also soon enough before the arrival of incoming freshmen that we could guarantee everything would be running perfectly with the new Radius backend by then. Since we're no longer doing lookups against AD for every connection, I needed to solve the problem of how to block access for a user or a device if needed. There's many reasons you might need to do this. An employee leaves the organization, a student graduates, a device is lost or stolen. Certificate revocation lists do exist. These are lists published by the certificate authorities that list certificates that have been revoked for one reason or another and are no longer valid. Sometimes these lists are only partial, they don't contain the full list of revoked certs, only the ones that have been revoked in a certain recent time period, and they update maybe every 24 hours. Whatever the time may be, it's not at all fast enough to respond to a security incident. So by leveraging the APIs built into our identity management system, SecureW2, CA's APIs, and of course the APIs provided by MIST, we can add a username and/or a certificate to a policy that enforces immediate blocking regardless of the status of the CRL. One final note, blocking is not the same as revoking a certificate. Let's say that Keith loses his laptop. We would need to block his ability to connect to the network. If we revoke his laptop cert in the CA, when he finds his laptop, he no longer has a valid credential and he won't be able to connect. So we leverage that Radius policy to just temporarily deny access and keep the cert still valid. You can unblock a certificate, but you cannot unrevoke a certificate. Since I do have a minute left, I'll slightly change topics. There's been a lot of talk about WPA3 and Eduroam this week. We turned on WPA3 transition mode in March of last year. It's important to note that this change affects anyone who visits your campus, not just your own users. The graph here is showing the number of clients connected with what WPA version at the time I turned on WPA3 support. As you can see, all but about a dozen devices started using WPA3 once it became available. And I'm happy to say that I've had 0 trouble tickets involving WPA3 or lack of compatibility for transition mode after flipping this switch. We are still running transition mode today. Eduroam is all about ease of use by visitors, and not every device that a visitor brings to campus might support WPA3. So I'm going to be keeping an eye on this graph over the next several months, and when I feel that we've kind of reached the bottom watermark of WPA2 clients, then I'll start a conversation about switching fully to WPA3. Thank you.